The average American household paid $6,500 last year in interest, fees, and financial charges. Not in taxes. Not in housing. In the pure cost of participating in the American consumer financial system. That figure comes from documented federal data. And by the time this analysis is complete, you will understand exactly where that money went, who designed the system that collected it, and what the scientific evidence says about the behavioral architecture that can reduce it dramatically. That architecture is not new. It is not complex. And the people who practiced it most faithfully had no financial advisors, no brokerage accounts, and in many cases, no formal education beyond the 8th grade. The data, research, and behavioral frameworks presented here are sourced from peer-reviewed academic publications, federal institutional reports from the Federal Reserve System, the FDIC, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and from documented historical economic records. This content is produced for educational and analytical purposes. It does not constitute individualized financial advice or investment recommendations. Individual financial circumstances vary significantly, and all financial decisions should be made in consultation with qualified professionals who have full knowledge of your specific situation. Now, let us examine what actually happened to the American household's financial position over the past 50 years, because the story most people have been told is incomplete in ways that are not accidental. In 1975, the average American household saved approximately 17 cents of every dollar it earned. That figure is documented by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. By 2005, that savings rate had dropped below zero. Americans were, on aggregate, spending more than they earned. Today, the savings rate has partially recovered to approximately 3.5%. The standard explanation for this collapse is cultural. Americans became more materialistic. Consumer culture took over. People simply chose to spend more. This explanation is convenient. It is also empirically incomplete. Because sitting alongside the savings rate data is a second dataset that most analysts decline to place in the same frame. And when you put them together, the picture changes entirely. In 1978, the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling in a case called Marquette National Bank of Minneapolis versus First of Omaha Service Corporation. Most Americans have never heard of it. The ruling effectively abolished state usury laws by allowing banks to export the interest rate limits of their home state nationally. 2 years later, in 1980, South Dakota eliminated all interest rate caps entirely. Citibank, which had been constrained by New York's usury limits, immediately relocated its credit card operations to South Dakota. Within a decade, the regulatory architecture that had previously constrained predatory lending rates was dismantled across most of the country. The average credit card annual percentage rate, which had been regulated into moderation before this ruling, began its documented climb. By 2024, it reached 21.59%, the highest figure ever recorded in the Federal Reserve's tracking history. Now place these two datasets in the same frame. The savings rate curve and the debt accumulation curve across American households from 1960 to today mirror each other with near-perfect inverse symmetry. As one falls, the other rises. This correlation does not exist because Americans spontaneously chose debt over savings. It exists because the regulatory architecture governing the cost of debt was systematically restructured. The generation that raised your grandparents lived before that restructuring. What they practiced was not old-fashioned. It was financially rational for a different regulatory environment. And the science that validates why it worked is more sophisticated than anything the financial industry has produced in the 50 years since. Here is where it becomes extraordinary. In 2001, Dr. Dražen Prelec and Dr. Duncan Simester at the MIT Sloan School of Management published a study in Marketing Science titled Always Leave Home Without It. Their research, combined with brain imaging work from Carnegie Mellon University, documented something that changes the entire framework of personal financial behavior. When you spend physical cash, your brain's insula cortex activates. The insula cortex is the region responsible for processing physical and social pain. Spending cash produces a measurable, documentable pain signal in the human brain. That signal inhibits further spending. It is not discipline. It is not willpower. It is neurobiology. And it is consistent across diverse populations, income levels, and educational backgrounds. Now here is the other half of that finding. When you pay with a credit card or a digital tap-to-pay system, that insula cortex activation does not occur. The pain signal is suppressed entirely. The neurological brake on spending is disengaged. And the behavioral consequence is measurable. Across multiple controlled studies, consumers spend an average of 12 to 18% more when using cards versus cash. In auction settings, Prelec and Simister documented that credit card users bid up to 2 times more than cash users for identical items. This is not a preference difference. It is the documented consequence of removing the brain's primary expenditure inhibition mechanism. The shift from cash wages to bank account deposits and card payments was framed as a convenience upgrade. Neurologically, it was a spending amplification mechanism. And the institution that collects the processing fees and the interest had a documented financial interest in that amplification occurring. The population scale consequence of this neurological dynamic is now calculable. If American households spend 12 to 18% more due to the decoupling of payment pain from purchase behavior, and if American consumer spending totals approximately $14 trillion annually, the behavioral premium associated with non-cash payment systems represents somewhere between $1.7 and $2.5 trillion in elevated annual expenditure. That number is not extracted by any single institution. But the institutional architecture that replaced physical cash with card-based payment systems participates in its generation. Now let us examine what the institutions that hold your savings were doing with your money during this same period, because this is the calculation that most financial content declines to perform with specificity. In 2023 and 2024, the Federal Reserve raised the federal funds rate to a 23-year high of 5.25 to 5.5%. During this same period, the FDIC's weekly national rates database documented that the national average annual percentage yield on savings accounts at major commercial banks, institutions like Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo, remained at approximately 0.46%. The comparison between those two numbers, placed side by side, represents the core profit engine of modern commercial banking. The bank used your deposited capital to earn at or near the federal funds rate. It returned to you less than 0.5%. If you held $10,000 in a standard savings account at one of America's 4 largest banks in 2023, you earned approximately $46. The bank used that same $10,000 to generate earnings of approximately $525. The difference, $479, is your money's earning power that the institution retained. Every single year. Your grandmother's post office savings book was not primitive financial behavior. It was resistance to this extraction mechanism, practiced before she had the data to name it. Individual circumstances vary significantly, and the appropriate application of these principles to your specific situation requires consideration of your full financial picture. But the structural mechanism described here is documented institutional reality, not conjecture. Now we arrive at the framework that connects everything. In 2017, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences to Dr. Richard Thaler of the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. The primary mechanism Thaler received the prize for identifying and formalizing is called the commitment device. A commitment device is a mechanism that pre-commits you to a savings or behavioral outcome before temptation arrives. In Thaler's Save More Tomorrow program, documented in research published in the Journal of Political Economy, participants who pre-committed to automatic savings increases saw their savings rates rise from 3.5% to 13.6% over 40 months. That is a 300 to 400% improvement compared to willpower-based savings attempts. The underlying behavioral economics explains why. Human beings systematically overweight present consumption relative to future benefit, a phenomenon Thaler documented as present bias. When savings requires an active decision at the moment of temptation, present bias wins almost every time. When savings is pre-committed and automatic, present bias never gets a vote. What your grandmother did with a tin box in her kitchen drawer, allocating wages into physically separated, psychologically designated categories before any spending decision was made, was the same mechanism that won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2017. The science caught up to the practice. The practice was correct all along. Behavioral economics also provides the scientific grounding for why physically separated funds resist spending in ways that pooled digital balances do not. Thaler's mental accounting theory documents that funds which are psychologically designated for a specific purpose are statistically significantly less likely to be spent on other categories than equivalent funds held in a single undifferentiated account. The modern implementation of this principle requires no tin box. It requires a separate institution, a separate account with no debit card access, and an automatic transfer scheduled for the day income arrives. The behavioral architecture is identical. The neurological mechanism is identical. The scientific validation is Nobel level. The bilateral nature of compound interest is the next structural reality that institutional finance has a documented interest in obscuring from retail consumers. Compound interest is not a savings concept. It is a mathematical force that works with equal power in two directions. When it works for you, it is the foundational engine of generational wealth. When it works against you, it is the most efficient wealth extraction mechanism ever constructed. The average American credit card annual percentage rate in 2024 stood at 21.59%. On a $5,000 balance, carried at minimum payment, the total amount repaid over the life of that debt approaches 3 times the original principal. At the national scale, with total American credit card debt exceeding $1.13 trillion for the first time in recorded history, the implied annual interest extraction from American consumers to credit card issuers is approximately $243 billion. To place that in context, $243 billion exceeds the entire gross domestic product of Portugal. That transfer occurs annually. It occurs silently. And it is the direct mathematical inverse of the wealth that the generation before the 1978 regulatory change retained by keeping compound interest on their side of the ledger. Every dollar in interest you do not pay is a dollar that compounds for you instead of against you. The community capital dimension of your grandparents' financial architecture has a scientific grounding that is even less commonly understood. Professor Robin Dunbar of Oxford University's Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology identified, through analysis of neocortex ratios across primate species, that human beings are cognitively calibrated to maintain stable reciprocal relationships with approximately 150 individuals. Within that group, which researchers call Dunbar's number, trust, reciprocity, and mutual economic obligation function at their biological maximum efficiency. At their peak in the early 20th century, documented historical scholarship estimates that approximately 1 in 3 American adults belonged to a mutual aid society or friendly society. These organizations, which operated savings pools, insurance funds, and community lending mechanisms, were functioning at almost exactly the scale that Oxford's evolutionary anthropology research identifies as the biological optimum for human cooperative behavior. Modern commercial financial products did not replace these systems because they were more efficient for participants. They replaced them because they were more profitable for institutions. The distinction is precise and important. The total cost of ownership framework, used by the procurement departments of every Fortune 500 company in America and taught in every MBA program in the country, was applied intuitively by your grandfather every time he stood in front of a purchasing decision. Fortune 500 CFOs do not ask what something costs. They ask what the total extraction from organizational resources will be over the full life of the relationship with that asset. A $200 pair of quality boots lasting 10 years costs $20 per year. A $40 pair lasting 18 months costs $32 per year, 60% more expensive while providing a measurably inferior experience across the decade. Your grandfather was running this analysis in his head before every significant purchase. He didn't have the terminology. He had something more durable, a bone-deep understanding that the price tag is not the cost, and that institutional consumer culture profits from your confusion of the two. Research published in the Journal of Political Economy by Lusardi, Michaud, and Mitchell in 2017 found that financial literacy differences account for 30 to 40% of the wealth inequality gap between American households. Not income level. Not educational attainment. Not inheritance. Financial literacy. The Federal Reserve's 2022 survey of consumer finances documents that children raised in households where money management is explicitly discussed accumulate 3 times more wealth by age 40 than those raised in households where money is a taboo subject. When your great-grandparents sat their children down and taught them to divide their wages, save first and spend second, they were performing the highest return investment of their entire financial lives. The return on that investment, measured in lifetime household wealth differential, exceeds virtually any other single financial decision most families will ever make. The final structural mechanism your grandparents' system preserved is the one that Harvard and Princeton researchers documented with the greatest precision. Dr. Sendhil Mullainathan, then at Harvard University, and Dr. Eldar Shaffer at Princeton University, published research demonstrating that financial scarcity occupies cognitive bandwidth at a magnitude equivalent to losing 13 IQ points. 13 points is the difference between average cognitive performance and measurable impairment. The Federal Reserve's 2023 report on the economic well-being of U.S. households found that 37% of Americans could not cover a $400 emergency without borrowing. Those 37% are not merely financially vulnerable. The Harvard and Princeton research documents that they are neurologically compromised, at a measurable and documented level, in their ability to make the precise decisions that would improve their situation. This is the scarcity trap. Financial stress consumes cognitive capacity. Reduced cognitive capacity produces worse financial decisions. Worse financial decisions deepen financial stress. The rainy day jar was not superstition. It was cognitive protection technology that interrupted this cycle at its earliest stage and kept the brain operating at full capacity during the exact moments when clear thinking was most essential. Every strategy examined in this analysis shares one underlying mathematical logic. Each one either reduces the rate of institutional extraction from your financial resources, increases your rate of retention, or compounds the behavioral advantage of the others. The cash payment system reduces spending by 12 to 18% through documented neurological mechanisms. The commitment device increases savings rates by 300 to 400%. The debt refusal eliminates the 21.59% annual extraction rate. The community capital system distributes mutual costs without institutional margin capture. The quality purchasing principle reduces total lifetime household expenditure through total cost of ownership discipline. The financial literacy transmission multiplies all of these effects across generations. None of these strategies require complexity. None require significant capital. All require understanding the structural logic of the system you are operating inside. Here is the 5-step implementation sequence, ranked by impact to effort ratio. First, calculate your current annual financial extraction. Total interest paid, fees paid, and the net interest margin gap on your savings balance. Write that number down. It is your baseline. Second, implement a cash-based spending protocol for variable expenses for 30 days and track the spending reduction percentage. This is your personal replication of the MIT study. Third, compare the annual percentage yield at your current savings institution against credit union alternatives and high-yield savings accounts with documented member surplus orientation. Calculate the annual dollar difference and move the balance. Fourth, establish one pre-committed automatic savings transfer, scheduled for the day income arrives, to a separate institution with no debit card access. Label the account with its designated purpose. Fifth, have one specific, data-driven conversation about money with any child in your sphere of influence. Use one data point from this analysis. The research documents a 3 times lifetime wealth differential as the return on that single investment. The strategies documented here are not historical curiosities. They are scientifically validated behavioral systems documented, measured, and peer-reviewed by institutions from MIT to Oxford to the Nobel Committee. They were practiced intuitively by a generation that understood, without the data, what the data now confirms. Control of your money begins with understanding who else wants it, how they are getting it, and what it costs you when they do. The science is unambiguous. The implementation is yours. And if you believe this single structural reality is the only systemic trap currently operating against your financial position, the next analysis I have prepared will show you precisely how many others your portfolio is exposed to right now.